Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Look, today we are going to do something a little different. We're going to fundamentally shift how you view something you probably spend a whole lot of energy trying to avoid, and that is human fallibility. Messing up, getting things wrong. If you've ever felt that burning sting of making a really public mistake, or, if you've ever found yourself digging your heels into an argument just to avoid admitting defeat, even when you kind of knew you were losing, well, you are absolutely in the right place. By the time we wrap up this explainer, you are going to walk away with a really clear, incredibly practical framework for navigating the margin of error in your own life. And more importantly, you'll actually understand why getting things wrong isn't some glitch in the matrix, it's actually one of our most profound, defining human capacities. So let's just dive right into this.
I want you to take a second and really, truly ask yourself, how does it actually feel to be wrong? Now, we all know the feeling of being right? It's that gleeful, undeniable rush. It's a tiny internal victory lap where you feel like you've just conquered the world. But realizing we are wrong, oh man, that is a completely different story. Let's be real, it leaves us feeling deflated, idiotic, and deeply ashamed. It's exactly like being back in grade school and having a term paper handed back to you just completely covered in red ink. It makes your stomach drop and your heart sink. At best, being wrong is a really annoying nuisance, but at worst, it's an absolute nightmare. We tend to treat our own wrongness as if it's some rare, bizarre aberration in the normal order of the universe, like we've somehow uniquely failed at being a functioning human being.
But what if that completely natural, gut-wrenching feeling of shame is actually based on a massive misunderstanding? That brings us to our source material for today. It's a phenomenal, foundational text called Being Wrong: Adventures in the Margin of Error, written by the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Kathryn Schulz. Her work is an absolute game-changer, and it brilliantly illustrates the core thesis we're going to be unpacking together today. And that thesis is this: error is not an inexplicable aberration. It is not a defect in your character, and it is certainly not a sign of moral failure. Rather, it is a fundamental, completely predictable, and honestly a wildly necessary part of human cognition. Fallibility isn't a bug, it's built right into our very design.
So here is our roadmap for today, tracking right alongside the exact chronological index of the book. We're going to start off with Part 1, the idea of error. Then we'll move into Part 2, the origins of error. After that, Part 3 covers the experience of error, and finally, we'll wrap up with Part 4, embracing error.
Okay, starting right off with Part 1, the idea of error. Before we can even begin to change how we handle our own mistakes, we really have to take a hard look at how society currently views them. Right now, we typically operate on what Schulz calls the pessimistic model. And in this view, error is treated harshly. It's treated as hard, undeniable evidence of stupidity or laziness or incompetence or sometimes even moral failure. In this model, wrongness simply equals embarrassment and a massive loss of social status. Take this really striking example from the book. Journalist Ross Gelbspan once incorrectly reported that a prominent environmental scientist was pregnant. Now, in the grand scheme of things, it was a completely harmless reporting mistake, right? Nobody died. But decades later, he still remembered the deep, lingering, visceral humiliation of that moment. That right there, that is the pessimistic model at work. But there is an alternative way to look at this, and it's called the optimistic model. In this completely flipped view, error is actually what produces surprise. It drives discovery, it creates humor, and it fuels creativity. Now, obviously, some errors are truly destructive, we can't ignore that. But our desperate, paralyzing fear of making any mistake often creates this dangerous intellectual rigidity that completely stunts our growth as individuals.
The founding father, Benjamin Franklin, actually recognized this exact dynamic centuries ago. He had this brilliant observation where he noted that truth is uniform and narrow. But as he put it, error is endlessly diversified. The soul has room enough to expand herself. I just love that phrasing. Think about what that means. Avoiding mistakes entirely isn't just impossible, actually scratch that, it's highly undesirable. Error is actually a vital, incredibly beautiful window into our imaginative minds and our boundless faculties. When you're making mistakes, it shows that you're actively engaged with the world, getting your hands dirty, and really trying to figure it all out.
Which brings us to Part 2, the origins of error.
So if error is so incredibly natural and human, where does it actually come from? Well, we all love to think of ourselves as super rational beings, right? We think we objectively gather evidence and then carefully form a logical belief. But human reasoning usually operates in a totally flawed loop. It goes like this. First, we form a belief, usually based on gut instinct or social conditioning. Then, step 2, we go out and search for evidence. Crucially, in step 3, and this is where things go off the rails, We run that evidence through an interpretation process that is heavily filtered by our existing bias. We throw out what we don't like and keep what we do. And finally, step 4, we end up with a strengthened belief. I mean, just think about political echo chambers for a second. Our core cognitive problem isn't a lack of evidence out there in the world. It's that we constantly, relentlessly filter new evidence just to support the comfortable story we've already decided is true. The wild reality is that our reasoning, our own physical senses, and our communities inevitably end up tricking us.
And knowing that loop leads us right into a really dangerous seductive trap. A satisfying explanation is not always a true explanation. We fall for this all the time. When someone violently disagrees with us, what's our first instinct? We usually assume they are either completely ignorant, totally foolish, or maybe even inherently evil. Why do we do that? Because that explanation feels incredibly satisfying. It perfectly protects our own fragile ego. We mistake a coherent, comfortable story for the actual truth. But Schulz makes this brilliant point that sometimes intellectual confusion, literally just sitting in the messy, uncomfortable ambiguity of not knowing the answer, is so much healthier for us than grasping at premature certainty just because it gives us a warm, fuzzy feeling.
Let's transition into part 3, the experience of error.
All right, so we've looked at the mechanical reasons of why we screw up, but what actually happens inside our heads when our deepest convictions suddenly collapse? This brings us to what I think is the most mind-bending aha moment of this entire explainer, a concept called error blindness. Really think about this for a second. You cannot simultaneously hold a false belief and know that you are wrong. It's impossible. While you are wrong, you experience yourself as being absolutely 100% right. The sentence, "I am wrong," actually contains a logical problem in the present tense. The realization of error only ever happens after the fact. Your lived experience is always, "I am right, something happens, oh man, I was wrong." This paradox is absolutely huge. It explains why arrogance isn't always the root cause of someone's stubborn certainty. Sometimes they literally, genuinely cannot see the error yet because they are entirely blind to it in the present moment.
To give this idea some really profound historical weight, consider this crazy fact. 1,200 years before Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am," St. Augustine wrote, "Faller ergo sum," which translates to "I err, therefore I am." Our unique, seemingly frustrating capacity to screw things up is fundamentally what separates us from machines, and it keeps us suspended beautifully between lesser animals and the divine. Think about it. We don't just passively reflect reality like a mirror. We hatch absolutely crazy ideas, we pursue wild pipe dreams, and we tell incredibly complex stories about the world. Error is simply the tax we pay for our incredible, reality-bending human imagination.
But that raises a big question. If error is so deeply fundamental to who we are, why do we feel so incredibly disconnected from it most of the time? Well, you have to notice what is missing from our mental filing cabinets. We don't have a neat, logical, color-coded folder in our brain labeled "mistakes I have made." We just don't. Instead, we take those memories and we file our errors away under embarrassment, or failure, or anger, or just generally bad experiences. And because we aggressively scatter the evidence of our own wrongness all over the place, it creates this incredibly dangerous illusion that our current, present-day worldview has always been our worldview. We completely forget how many times we've actually had to pivot, adapt, and change our minds in the past.
And, let's be totally honest here. Not all errors are created equal. There are definitely degrees of wrongness. Forgetting where you put your keys, that's one thing. It's annoying, but what about massive, existential errors? The heartbreak of error is unimaginably profound when it shatters your entire worldview. Take the incredibly tragic real-world case of Penny Berenson, which Schulz discusses. Penny mistakenly identified a man named Glenn Woodall as her attacker. Now, years later, when definitive DNA evidence finally proved she was wrong, she didn't just have to face a simple factual error. She had to reckon with the total, devastating collapse of her own deeply held interpretation of a profoundly traumatic event. She was absolutely, undeniably certain, yet she was entirely mistaken. That specific kind of error doesn't just sting, it can completely shatter you and then forcefully require you to reconstruct your very identity from the ground up.
So how do we move forward? That brings us to our final section, Part 4, Embracing Error. We have spent this time seeing how painful, confusing, and deeply human it is to be wrong. So how do we actually use this information? Well, this brings us to a brilliant, practical application for both how we run businesses and how we manage our personal lives. When a mistake happens, the lazy, default human response is personal blame. We immediately start pointing fingers and shouting, "Who screwed up?" But if you look at incredibly high-stakes environments like commercial aviation or complex medicine, they don't do that. They use systemic learning. They ask a totally different question. Why was this error possible in the first place, and how can we design the system to detect it next time? We have to start building organizations and, honestly, intimate relationships that fundamentally expect human error to occur. The goal isn't to ruthlessly demand perfection from everyone, it's to focus on early detection and structural improvement rather than tearing people down with personal blame.
And this leads us directly to the core paradox of error. It goes like this. If you desperately, obsessively desire to eliminate all mistakes from your life, you actually end up creating a dangerous intellectual rigidity. You become totally defensive, you stop listening to feedback, and you stop investigating your own beliefs. But paradoxically, the absolute willingness to openly acknowledge your mistakes is what creates true, dynamic adaptability. Fully accepting your fallibility is precisely what makes you more accurate and successful in the long run, because it's the only thing that keeps your mind genuinely open to new, contradictory, and potentially life-saving evidence.
Let's start bringing this home by ending our philosophical deep dive on a really inspirational high note with something Schulz calls the optimistic meta-induction. Look back at the grand sweep of history. Scientific theories, political beliefs, and social conventions have constantly, endlessly changed. Ideas that once appeared completely unquestionable to the smartest people on Earth eventually became totally obsolete. Now, you could view all that history pessimistically, as a chronicle of failure. But the optimistic view is that humanity's past errors are actually the very stepping stones for our progress. The simple fact that we can abandon old, outdated beliefs proves our incredible, unmatched capacity to learn. Every single time we swallow our pride and say out loud, "I was wrong," we literally give ourselves access to a brand new, vastly better version of reality.
So, before we go, I want to leave you with a really clear, actionable call to action. Before you make your next big life decision, or the very next time you find yourself digging your heels into a heated argument, I want you to pause and run through this simple 5-question framework. Question 1. What do I actually currently believe? Lay it out. Question 2. Why do I believe it? Be honest. Is it just gut intuition, or do I have hard evidence? Question 3. What evidence actually contradicts my belief right now? Question 4, and this is the absolute most important one. What would actually prove me wrong? Listen, if your answer to that is nothing, then you don't have a working hypothesis. You have a rigid, unchangeable dogma. And finally, question 5. If I do discover I am wrong, what exactly will I do next? Using this framework completely transforms error. It takes it from being a humiliating, ego-crushing defeat and turns it into an active, empowering process of learning.
To conclude this explainer, I want to leave you with one final, incredibly powerful question to chew on. What is something you are absolutely certain of right now that you just might be wrong about? Let that idea provoke you for a bit. Let it encourage you to deeply, honestly reflect on your most guarded convictions. Embracing that tiny, creeping sense of doubt isn't a weakness. It is the very beginning of true discovery as you navigate your own adventures in the margin of error. Thanks so much for joining this explainer, and whatever you do, keep questioning.